1959 was a pivotal year for Pontiac in so many different ways, and we're going to talk about one of them in particular, the overall wide-track stance and the wide-track Pontiacs, as this was the year that that particular marketing scheme was birthed, and it would last all the way through to the 1990s and even early 2000s on some Pontiac vehicles. But 1959 vehicles were not only innovative for that wide-track stance. Pontiacs of 1959 also had enlarged V8s. The new V8 engines went from 370 cubic inches in 1958 to 389 cubic inches in 1959. And those 389s would stay with Pontiac all the way through to the 1967 model year when they would be enlarged to 400 cubic inches. The other amazing thing about the 1959 model year is that it really was the year that Pontiac set out a styling trend and also a styling, let's just say, formula that it would employ all the way through till its final years. And that is that split twin port grille where you have the two grilles on either side. This was initiated in 1959. And interestingly, Pontiac division stylists didn't know that this was going to be such a hit and such a great looking front end that in 1960, Pontiacs don't have this split grille before they return to it again in 1961 across the lineup, not only on the full-size cars, but also on the new for 1961 Pontiac Tempest, which I think is a pretty handsome little car. In any case, that split grille theme would be employed on many different Pontiacs throughout the years. The only Pontiacs that I can think of that didn't have it are the aforementioned 1960 Pontiacs, the Fiero, at least some variants, the early variant, the 1984 variant, and the latter variants of the Pontiac 6000 STE. But aside from that, Pontiacs pretty much had that twin port grille on everything else. Now, as I mentioned today, what we're really going to focus on in this video is the wide track stance, because that is what came out in 1959. And how did that come out? Well, back then, there was a general manager of Pontiac named Bunky Knudsen. Bunky would later, if you've been watching this channel, you'd know that he would later go to Ford Motor Company and become president of Ford Motor Company, where he would put the so-called Bunky beak on many different cars because he wanted Fords to look more like Pontiac. And I think sometimes that was more successful than other times, but that was his idea. Well, for 1959, if you recall, General Motors redid its entire vehicle lineup. The 1958s were thrown in the trash, and the designs for the 1959s were thrown in the trash. Once General Motors designers had seen what Chrysler was going to produce for the 1957 model year, the so-called forward-look Chryslers. And when you compare and contrast the styling of a 57 Chrysler product with a 58 General Motors product, the 58 General Motors products just look blobby and pudgy and old with these kind of thick roofs and very bubbly round sides. The 57 Chrysler products across the entire lineup were just styling achievements and set a completely new direction for everybody to head in. As a result, and as I previously mentioned, General Motors designers, once they saw these 57 Chrysler products down at the Mound Road assembly plant where Chrysler was making them, they came back and decided that they needed to take styling in a new direction. And the 1959 Pontiac was one of the results of that particular effort, but that was true across the entire General Motors vehicle lineup. Now, upon seeing the design proposals for the 1959 Pontiacs, it was allegedly Bunky Knudsen who thought that the cars looked overbodied just because the cars were so much wider and lower, and as a result, the vehicles really needed an increased track so that they looked appropriate, because with the normal track, they just kind of looked overbodied and, like, as my friend John Manugian would say, a hippo on a bar stool. So the task of fixing this issue fell to Pontiac's then chief engineer Pete Estes, who would later become Pontiac's general manager and even president of General Motors. And what he did was he widened not only the front track, but also the rear track. And he actually widened the rear track by a little bit more than the front. So the front track on the 1959 Pontiacs is 63.7 inches, and the rear track is 64 inches. In contrast, if you take the track of a 1959 Chevrolet, the front is a little bit wider than the rear. It's the opposite of the Pontiac. More specifically, the front track on the 1959 Chevrolets is 60.3 inches, and the rear track is 59.3 inches. So the track on the 59 Pontiacs was, let's say, 4 to 5 inches greater than the track on the 1959 Chevrolets. That's quite a bit. 4 to 5 inches is a massive amount of increased track, especially when originally the vehicles were supposed to have all basically the same track. But Pontiac decided to go in a different direction. And the 1959 Pontiacs really have a wider track width than even competitive makes. If you take a look at the 1959 Fords, for example, they have a track width of between around 60 and 61 inches in the front and the rear. They do have a wider rear track than the front track, but still, the tracks overall are several inches narrower than that on the Pontiacs. And here's an advertising campaign from 1959 where Pontiac says, "Exclusively yours, the Widetrack wheels." Of course, I think this photo is a little bit exaggerated, but you get the point. You can see where the wheels would normally be set on your 1959 Pontiac. And I have to say that this ad is specific to U.S. Pontiacs because the Canadian Pontiacs rode atop Chevrolet chassis with some Chevrolet engines and transmissions. In fact, there was a 261 cubic inch inline six-cylinder that was the standard engine for Pontiacs in Canada, which was a U.S. medium-duty truck engine based on the Chevrolet 235 cubic inch inline six-cylinder. But take a look here at my 1959 Pontiac Parisienne. This is a similar car to what you would get in the U.S. The Parisienne effectively is a U.S. Catalina body in length with the Bonneville side trim and riding atop a Chevrolet Impala chassis with the track width of a Chevrolet Impala. And you can see exactly why Bunky Knudsen probably looked at this and thought, oh my goodness, this thing looks humorously over-bodied, because the Pontiac body also flares out at the bottom, whereas the Chevrolet body tucks in. So it helps, let's say, minimize the visual issues associated with the relatively narrow track width on the Chevrolet. But it doesn't work on the Pontiac. And you can see here that the Parisienne just looks hilarious. And that's one of the reasons why I like it. If I were buying one of these new in 1959, I probably would have thought it looked funny. But as a now collector car / classic many years later, I think it's just a humorous piece of history. And for those who don't know, this ad campaign would last many years. Throughout the 1960s, it kind of faded into obscurity in the 70s and 80s as Pontiac went toward more luxury-oriented vehicles in the 1970s and then obviously smaller vehicles in the 1980s. But it was revived on the 1997 Grand Prix that you see here was advertised as the Widetrack Grand Prix. And that appeared in most all of the advertisements as well as the brochures. And that was one of the best-looking cars, I think, from General Motors in the 1990s, if not the best-looking. It certainly was a great seller. It kind of competes with the 1995 Olds Aurora and the 1992 Seville, from my standpoint, in terms of best-looking GM cars of that era. And now we're going to talk about a bit of trivia that many people probably don't know about, including those who lived in southeastern Michigan during these Widetrack years. Now, Pontiac Motor Division was headquartered in the eponymous Pontiac, Michigan. And as a result, that was where most of the division's engineering and planning and everything took place. Now, in the early 1960s, the City Planning Commission decided that there needed to be a better way to get around Pontiac, Michigan, as opposed to driving through downtown, because it was just too hectic and too many traffic lights and too congested. And so they devised this perimeter road that went around Pontiac. And it was a perimeter road that was multiple lanes, 4 or 5 lanes, all one way. And it seems weird to say that it was one way, but this is not a very large perimeter road. It might be, let's say, a couple miles around the outer edge of the city of Pontiac. So it's seemingly a good idea. If you didn't want to go through downtown, you just go on this perimeter road. And you bypass downtown, you do it quickly because you're on a 4 or 5 lane, one-way street, and it makes a heck of a lot of sense. Of course, something like this now would be anathema to urban planners who want to route everybody through downtown because roads like this cut off the downtown from the suburbs. But this was relatively novel for the time and something that the City Planning Commission thought was a good idea. Now, here's where the interesting part comes in, because as I mentioned, Pontiac Motor Division was headquartered in Pontiac. So what do you think they ended up naming this heretofore unnamed perimeter road? Well, they decided to name it Widetrack Boulevard. Yes, that's right. Widetrack Boulevard was the name of it. And I can only imagine that it was named Widetrack Boulevard because of Pontiac. And it made sense. I mean, it really was a wide track. This is, like I said, a 4 or 5 lane, one-way road that goes around the city of Pontiac. It is still there, by the way. They renamed it, probably 10 years ago from being Widetrack Boulevard to Woodward Avenue, the Loop, because Woodward Avenue is the avenue that comes up if you go northbound on Woodward through Pontiac. For whatever reason, the name just changed at some point when it got to this perimeter road to Widetrack Boulevard. And I think people were confused as to what's Widetrack, what's Woodward. So they just named it Woodward Avenue, the Loop. Now, city planning commissioners today are trying to basically, let's just say, not tear down the road, but change its purpose and basically downsize it, put a median in the middle of it, have two-way traffic on it as opposed to one-way traffic to make it, let's say, more friendly to the urban environment. But back in the early 1960s, this was really a kind of novel concept, and you can see here in an article from 1964 where they're taking down houses and various businesses to make way for this Widetrack Avenue, which at the time, you'll note the newspaper just calls the Perimeter Road. But like I said, it ended up being named Widetrack Boulevard. So Pontiac was clearly so committed to the Widetrack concept, even a few years after it came out in 1959, that they decided to name this road, or kind of, let's say, probably pushed the City Planning Commission to name the road Widetrack. And like I said, it made sense. It really was a wide track. It was a huge, huge road. It still is a huge road. It's still there. You can travel it. And along the way, you'll see businesses that are still named Widetrack or have Widetrack in the name. And for those who don't know, that's because the road historically had that name. Further on down Woodward, down around Maple Road in the Birmingham area, years ago, that stretch of Woodward also used to be known as Hunter Boulevard, I believe. And they changed that maybe around the same time that they changed this Widetrack moniker. It might have been a little more than 10 years ago. Everything kind of blurs together now with COVID. It probably was closer to 15 or 20 years ago. But Woodward, for whatever reason, had various names, including this Widetrack Boulevard as well as Hunter Boulevard in Birmingham. It's all just now known as Woodward Avenue. And Woodward Avenue is the street that has the most, let's say, name recognition, especially since they've started the Woodward Avenue Dream Cruise 20 plus years ago. The street is well known not only in Michigan, but also the United States and even the world. So the Widetrack Pontiac not only birthed an advertising campaign and created wider vehicles, well, I guess they weren't wider in terms of the body, but wider track vehicles, and also created some street names. And I thought that that was something that many people might find interesting and didn't know. By the way, if you'd like to see more about Widetrack Pontiacs, check out Steve Magnanti's YouTube channel. He just did a video on a 59 Bonneville that's in a junkyard. And that kind of spurred this idea that I had here to talk about the actual street name in Pontiac. As well as somebody who grew up in Southeast Michigan, I certainly remembered it, and I remembered the name change as well. Thanks again for watching.